The squeak of the subway doors pierced the silence of the carriage as the train started moving again. People, as always, absorbed in their thoughts, sat or stood, paying no attention to each other. The carriage was quiet, with only the occasional muffled conversation or phone sound breaking the stillness. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but when the doors closed at one of the stations, everything changed. A man entered the carriage, swaying with a distinct smell of alcohol on him. His movements were unsteady and shaky, and it was immediately clear that he was drunk. He moved toward an elderly man sitting by the window, carefully leaning against his suitcase. The old man appeared peaceful, absorbed in his book, but something about the stranger's actions caught his attention. He looked up and saw the man approaching him. "Give me your wallet," the thug barked, waving his knife. The blade gleamed in the light, and the passengers in the carriage began to tense up, but no one dared to intervene. Whether from fear or laziness, it didn't matter. The elderly man froze, his hand trembling as he tried to grip his bag. He didn't know how to react. His mind hadn't yet caught up with the situation as the thug brought the knife closer, threatening him again. The subway rumbled as usual, but for the elderly man sitting by the window, all the noise and commotion felt far away. He wasn't paying attention to the noise. His thoughts were elsewhere, and his eyes followed the unfamiliar faces he had passed many times before. He wasn't easily frightened, but when the thug approached him with a knife in hand, his expression turned wary. His heart raced, but he tried to remain calm. "Give me your wallet, old man." The thug's voice was hoarse and ominous. He swung the knife, and its gleam illuminated the elderly man's face. This was the moment when everything in the world stopped. The elderly man felt his world start to close in. The knife was too close. He tried to say something, but no words came out. What could he do? He wasn't prepared for violence, and the thug's gaze was full of brutal determination. At that moment, the carriage doors opened. A man entered, confidently and calmly. Jason Statham. His face showed no emotion. His gait was steady, and he wasn't in a hurry. But something about his presence was different. When his eyes met the thug's, it was as if the whole carriage held its breath. The thug froze, knife in hand. He felt his confidence begin to melt away like ice beneath his feet. Jason continued on his path, but his gaze was persistent, cold. He didn't look at the thug with menace. He simply knew that this moment could not continue. The thug understood that. Jason, without slowing his pace, stepped closer. When he was beside the thug, the latter suddenly began to grow nervous. His hand trembled, and the knife seemed as if it was no longer in his control. The thug felt his confidence slipping away as Jason's steps drew nearer. Statham simply approached, his expression unchanged. When the knife was within reach, he grabbed the thug's hand, taking hold of his wrist with such ease that the thug didn't have time to realize what was happening. Jason pressed the thug's hand to his body, and his movement was instant but powerful. "Enough," Jason said calmly. "Please leave him alone." But the thug didn't give up. He yanked his hand away and with a sharp movement tried to stab Jason in the stomach. The strike was fast, but Statham had already anticipated the move. He smoothly sidestepped and grabbed the hand holding the knife, blocking the thug's attack. The train car filled with silence as everyone watched Jason and the thug engage in a lightning-fast struggle. Jason wasn't in a rush. He used minimal effort, but every movement was precise and lethal. The thug didn't give up. He was drunk, but his instincts wouldn't let him stop. He knew that if he showed any weakness, it would be over. He tried to strike again, but Jason once again took control of his arm. The passengers continued to watch this brutal and rapid exchange of blows, but they couldn't understand what was happening. All they saw were two people, one incredibly fast, and the other, despite his weakness, still fighting for his life. The thug roared in fury and tried to kick Jason. He sliced through the air, but Jason dodged once more, letting go of his arm and ducking under his strike. Statham was now behind him, grabbing the thug's arm and holding it at its full extension. But the thug, refusing to give up, fought with renewed strength. He yanked the knife out of Jason's grip and jumped to the side, trying to hit him. Statham jumped back, but the thug didn't relent. Jason knew that now his actions had to be decisive. He couldn't afford to drag the fight out for too long. In this tense moment, his movements became faster, and the thug grew more desperate. Not willing to give the thug any chance, Jason took the final step. He sharply grabbed the thug's wrist, and at the moment the thug tried to break free, Jason used his momentum to fling his arm upward. The knife slipped from his grasp, and Jason swiftly grabbed it, putting the thug in immediate danger. "Enough!" Jason's voice was loud and clear. Everyone froze. Even the thug, who had just been filled with rage and desperation, now felt his strength leaving him. He stood before this man who showed no fear, no fury, only cold determination. But the thug still didn't surrender. He lifted his head, and in his eyes burned despair. He was willing to do anything. In that moment, as he tried to jump at Jason, his body froze, as if something had pierced his soul. Statham was faster once again. The thug collapsed to the floor, his hand with the knife dropping, and his body ceased to resist. Jason looked at him like someone who no longer had the strength to fight. He left him lying there, not killing him, but not giving him a chance to continue. The elderly man watched this with his mouth agape. In his eyes there was not only fear but also astonishment. He couldn't believe that this moment could be so long and dangerous. When he shifted his gaze to Jason, the man stood, unaware of his victorious stance or the looks from the onlookers. He was calm, as always. But the thug, despite his defeat, wasn't going to give up so easily. He rose, preparing for a final rush, but Jason was ready for it. The fight continued. It seemed that the moment of climax had come, and Jason had already won. The thug was disarmed, his strength drained, but his eyes still burned with rage. He rose to his knees, his face twisted in a snarl, as if preparing to attack once more. Jason, ignoring the thug's pitiful attempts to stand, remained calm but tense. Every movement of his was calculated, every look deliberate. But suddenly the thug grabbed a piece of metal pipe from the table and with a wild cry jumped at Jason, determined to prove he wasn't ready to surrender. "You won't take it all so easily," the thug roared, his eyes blazing with troubled, almost insane resolve. He wasn't prepared for Jason, who merely nodded and stepped toward him, fully ready for such a move. The thug tried to strike him with the pipe, but Jason anticipated his move once again, dodging at the last moment, putting his shoulder forward to quickly block the blow. The pipe ricocheted to the side, and now the thug was in a more vulnerable position. At that moment, the thug, feeling his vulnerability, pulled something unexpected. He drew out a stun grenade hidden in his pocket and threw it sharply toward Jason, hoping to catch him off guard. Time seemed to slow as the grenade exploded in the air, showering sparks and a sound that shattered the silence of the carriage. Jason managed only to lean back for a moment, but the explosive force was so strong that it threw him aside. His body couldn't prepare in time, and he slammed sharply into the train's wall. His ears rang, and everything in front of his eyes blurred. Pain pierced his chest. Shrapnel from the grenade left painful wounds on his shoulder and side. The thug, not expecting such resilience from Jason, was shocked, but his face twisted into a snarl of fury. He lunged toward Statham while the man was still reeling from the explosion. Jason felt his chest fill with pain, but he didn't allow himself to stop. Cursing himself for underestimating the threat, he quickly rose to his feet. His heart was pounding, blood flowing from the wound, but his resolve was unbreakable. He couldn't afford to fall. He knew that if he didn't win, the thug would attack again. The thug leaped at him with the knife, aiming for his stomach. Jason barely managed to step aside, but all his movements were slowed by the pain. The knife grazed his abdomen, leaving a deep mark. Statham felt his strength draining, but he kept resisting. He grabbed the thug's arm and forcefully shoved him away. The thug swung again, preparing to strike, but Jason, summoning his last bit of strength, blocked his arm and executed a move that turned the tide of the fight. With incredible force, Jason knocked the thug off his feet, but the pain in his body prevented him from going full power. Still, he used this weakness against his opponent, driving his foot into the thug's chest. The blow was so strong that it sent the thug crashing backward into the train's wall. But Jason didn't allow himself to relax. The thug was still on his feet, trying to rise, but his movements became increasingly unsteady. He was wounded, his breathing shallow, and the injuries from the explosion and knife wound robbed him of strength. Meanwhile, Jason, despite his own injuries, continued to track every movement of the thug. He was ready to end the fight, but he didn't rush. His gaze was calm but resolute. He knew that any mistake could cost him his life. The thug attacked again, his movements jerky but filled with rage. He tried to stab Jason with the knife, but Jason dodged, and the thug missed. Jason used the moment to grab his wrist and slam him to the floor. The thug struggled to break free, but Jason held him tightly, feeling his own body suffer from the pain. He was wounded, but his spirit remained unyielding. Suddenly, Jason noticed that the thug was starting to lose strength. His strikes were becoming weaker. This was the moment when Jason could end the fight. He tightened his grip on the thug's wrist and twisted it sharply, forcing him to fall to the ground. The thug lay on the floor, his breathing heavy, and his attempts to rise were becoming rare and unsteady. But Jason understood that the moment when the thug could attack again had not yet come. He knew this man wouldn't give up so easily. He might rise, he might try again, and Jason was ready for that. Jason stood firm, still feeling the pain, but his gaze was focused. He looked at the thug, but felt no hatred, only cold resolve. There was no triumph in his eyes, only an understanding that the fight was not yet over. He looked at his wounds, but knew that at this moment he couldn't think about the pain. He walked toward the thug and, looking directly into his eyes, spoke. "You haven't won, and you won't win." As Jason turned to leave the train car and continue dealing with the consequences of his injury, something imperceptibly shifted. Another person entered through the door. This was not just some random passenger. This was someone Jason hadn't expected to see here. Jason's eyes darted toward the new opponent, and his heart raced once again. Something told him that the fight wasn't over here, and it wouldn't be finished so quickly. The thug was still lying on the floor, but something told Jason that after this moment, an even more difficult struggle would follow. He felt the atmosphere in the car shift again. When the doors of the train car opened once more, Jason felt the tension in the air immediately rise. He was still standing, trying to calm his breath after the injury and the fight with the thug. His body ached, blood slowly seeped from his wounds, but his eyes couldn't help but notice the figure that had entered the car. The man was middle-aged, dressed in a dark cloak, with an unreadable expression on his face. His steps were confident, and each of his glances left the impression that he knew more than he should. The seconds dragged on as Jason and the stranger locked eyes. In Jason's eyes was calmness, but that calm was quickly replaced by unease. He realized this man wasn't a coincidence. His presence in the car was not accidental, and he definitely didn't come here just for nothing. The stranger stopped, looked at Jason, then shifted his gaze to the thug who was still lying on the floor, struggling to catch his breath. Without a word, the man in the dark cloak slowly approached him. He wasn't rushing. His movements were deliberate and confident. "You thought this was it?" he whispered to the thug. His voice was quiet, but there was an unmistakable threat in it. "You have no idea what's just begun." Jason tensed. Who was this man? He knew this wasn't just another passerby. The thug, as soon as he heard those words, flinched as if something inside him ignited. He couldn't believe that someone else had come to intervene. The fear disappeared from his eyes, replaced by a new fire, a fear of the unknown. The man in the dark cloak turned to Jason and locked eyes with him. There was no doubt in his gaze. He knew that Jason, despite his wounds, was a dangerous opponent. But that didn't scare him. "You think you can just stop me?" the stranger asked mockingly. His voice was soft but so confident that the words seemed to resonate in the air. "You know too much, Jason, and that makes you a threat." Jason felt his heart start to beat faster. Who was this man? How did he know his name? This wasn't just some random passerby. Jason was sure that he was facing something much more serious. The stranger took a step forward, and Jason felt the tension in the air increase. He knew that the fight with this man would be much more brutal than with the thug. Jason stood up despite the pain in his body. He knew that if he didn't act now, he might be dead in the next second. He quickly assessed the situation. The thug, though wounded, was still on the floor, but he was clearly ready to rise at any moment. The man in the dark cloak was more dangerous than he had seemed at first. The stranger moved a few steps forward, his movement almost imperceptible, and before Jason could react, he was already within striking distance. He moved so fast that Jason didn't have time to fully prepare. The stranger's fingers tightened and a hidden knife appeared in his hand, gleaming ominously in the light like a shadow of doom. Jason felt the adrenaline surge through his veins once more. He jumped to the side, trying to dodge the strike, but the knife plunged into his side, creating another wound. The thug, not expecting such resilience from Jason, was shocked, but his face twisted into a snarl of fury. He lunged at Statham while the man was still recovering from the explosion. Jason felt his chest fill with pain, but he didn't allow himself to stop. Cursing himself for underestimating the threat, he quickly rose to his feet. His heart was racing, blood was flowing from his wound, but his resolve was unbreakable. He couldn't afford to fall. He knew that if he didn't win, the thug would attack again. The thug jumped at him with a knife, aiming for his stomach. Jason barely managed to step aside, but all his movements were slowed by the pain. The knife scraped across his abdomen, leaving a deep gash. Statham felt his strength wane, but he continued resisting. He grabbed the thug's arm and with great effort pushed him away. The thug, swinging again, prepared to strike, but Jason, gathering his last strength, blocked his arm and executed a move that turned the tide of the fight. With incredible force, Jason knocked the thug off his feet, but the pain in his body prevented him from going full force. Still, he used that weakness against the opponent, landing a powerful kick to the thug's chest. The blow was so strong that it sent him flying back, crashing into the train's wall. But Jason didn't allow himself to relax. The thug was still on his feet, trying to rise, but his movements became increasingly unsteady. This was the moment when Jason could end the fight. He tightened his grip on the thug's wrist and twisted it sharply, forcing him to fall to the ground. But despite his defeat, the thug wasn't giving up so easily. He rose, preparing for one last rush, but Jason was ready for it. All this time, the train car had been filled with passengers, and they had become witnesses to this brutal struggle. All of them, seemingly paralyzed, couldn't comprehend what was happening, but the tension in the air was growing stronger. Suddenly, one of the passengers, noticing how Jason was fighting with the thug and how severely he was wounded, pulled out his phone and called for help. "We're calling an ambulance and the police," shouted one of the men, trying to get attention. Other passengers began doing the same. Some were filming the event, while others shouted at people not to interfere. One passenger rushed to the door to call for help at the nearest station. Jason felt the pressure closing in on him. He knew that help wouldn't come quickly, but every moment was precious. He couldn't afford to give up. Yet, time was slipping away and the pain was getting worse. Jason stood on his feet, facing another decisive moment. The man in the dark cloak was relentless. He took another step toward Jason, preparing for the next attack. But in that moment, hearing the shouts of the people, he unexpectedly froze. He glanced at the thug, who was still lying on the floor, and realized the situation was spiraling out of control. "You won't win?" Jason said, looking him straight in the eyes. His voice was hoarse from the pain, but as firm as ever. The stranger slowly stepped back, his face showing frustration, but he didn't retreat entirely. His eyes flickered toward the train door at the moment when the police and ambulance were already approaching. He understood that his time to leave had come. "This isn't over, Jason," he said quietly, stepping toward the door. The train doors finally opened, and the noise from outside rushed into the car, immediately filling the space. The sounds of the street, the sounds of approaching help, all blended into a single intense wave. Jason felt the tension in the air reach its peak, and despite the pain from his injuries, he stood still, preparing for the next turn of events. When the door opened, it wasn't just the police standing there. A pair of armed officers entered confidently, followed by the ambulance prepared for the emergency. They had arrived just in time, but everything wasn't over yet. The paramedics immediately moved toward Jason, noticing his wounds. But at that moment, the officers were already seizing the thugs, not giving them a chance to escape. One of the officers glanced at Jason briefly but didn't linger. For him, this was just another operation, and he was a professional in his field. Meanwhile, no matter how hard Jason tried to stay calm, a sense of unease burned in his chest. The thugs they had captured were clearly not random criminals. While one was tied to street crimes, the second, the man in the dark cloak, proved to be far more dangerous. The subway car was filled with noise as the officers began to restrain the two captured thugs. One was completely exhausted, clearly unable to resist. He had been brutally beaten, his face covered in bruises, and his clothes were stained with blood from his recent altercation with Jason. The second, the man in the dark cloak, stood with a tense expression on his face, as if searching for an escape. His gaze was sharp, and he clearly wasn't ready to give up so easily. Despite his exhaustion and injuries, Jason didn't take his eyes off them. He knew that simply taking them into custody wasn't the end. Behind each of them was something bigger, something more serious. He felt that they were playing a game with rules he didn't yet understand. What would happen next? Why had the man in the dark cloak been in the subway, and what did he want from the thug? At that moment, a police officer approached Jason, anxiously inspecting his wounds. "You need to go to the hospital," he said firmly. "We'll take these two, but it's better to wait for help." Jason nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. He knew that his thoughts couldn't leave them. He understood. What had happened today was part of something much more dangerous. While the doctors began tending to Jason's wounds, the police officers tried to piece together the details of the incident. One of the officers moved toward the thugs, trying to get answers. One of them, the one covered in blood and bruises, was still struggling to breathe and making painful sounds. "Who are you?" the officer asked, sitting down next to him. His tone was firm, but not harsh. He wanted answers, and he knew they'd crack this thug. But the thug just gritted his teeth and gave the officer a mocking look. "You think this is the end?" His voice was quiet, but it held so much hatred that it sent shivers down the officer's spine. "This is just the beginning. Believe me, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." The officer froze. He realized that this man couldn't just be ignored, but there was no time for further questioning. He waved his colleagues over. "Take him. Get him to the station. We need to deal with his associates," he said. Jason, sitting nearby, felt his heart race faster. He was certain that the thug hadn't said those words by chance. It was a warning. There was something threatening in his eyes, something that went beyond simple street-level disputes. This was a game with high stakes. As the ambulance began transporting Jason to the hospital, the police officers continued with their interrogations. But just as they were about to leave with the thugs, one of the officers returned to Jason with a concerned look on his face. "We checked the security footage," he said. "These two aren't just random thugs. They were part of something bigger. Despite his pain, Jason couldn't help but ask, "What do you mean?" His voice was controlled, but there was curiosity in it. "The man in the dark cloak," the officer continued. "He was seen on other cameras in several parts of the city. He's not just a petty thief. He was connected to a group that's recently been linked to several major crimes. This isn't just street gangs. This is something serious." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Everything that had been happening was beginning to take shape. He wasn't just some random hero in this story. "We're investigating this case," the officer added, "but you seem to have gotten involved in a more dangerous game than I thought." Jason nodded, realizing that this was not just a random scuffle in the subway. He was caught up in something bigger, and it wasn't just him. When Jason arrived at the hospital, they stitched up his wounds, bandaged him, and conducted several tests. He was completely exhausted, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. He knew that after this incident, his life would never be the same again. He stood on the brink of something much more dangerous. Before he could calm down, one of the officers who had been with him at the scene of the incident visited him. "We have a few questions, Jason," he said. "We think you should tell us what you know about those people. You're involved now, and we need you to help us figure this out." Jason knew that a lot depended on him now. With each passing day, the situation was becoming more complicated. He had found himself at the center of a game where the stakes were much higher than just the lives of a few thugs. He was sure this story wouldn't end here. That evening, as Jason sat in his hospital room, the door opened and the elderly man he had saved in the subway entered. He was wearing the same expensive suit and old-fashioned hat that Jason remembered, but now his face showed no fear. He walked into the room confidently, his eyes now sparkling with determination. "You survived," he said, standing by the door. His voice was quiet but heavy with meaning. "That means you've figured it out?" Jason's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the old man in surprise, trying to process what was happening. How could this man be involved in what had transpired? He had been the helpless old man Jason saved from the thug in the subway. "Who are you?" Jason asked, holding back the pain but not hiding his astonishment. "Why are you here?" The old man smiled wryly, walking closer. He removed his hat and sat on the chair next to Jason's bed. His gaze was serious, even heavy. "I'm not who you thought I was," he said, as if reading Jason's thoughts. "It was all set up. I've been watching you, watching how you act, and watching what you did today." Jason furrowed his brow, not understanding. "You saved me in the subway, but you didn't know I was actually your test. It's not a coincidence that you ended up here in this situation," the old man continued. "I was the one who led you into this world." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. He had always thought saving the old man was a random act, but now everything seemed like part of some carefully thought-out plan. You were part of this?" Jason asked, his voice trembling with the realization that all this time he might have been just a pawn in someone's game. The old man nodded. "I'm not just an old man. I was the one leading this project, the one watching you. You didn't know that at this moment you became part of something bigger. I wasn't in that train by accident. It was a test of your strength, your ability to survive in a world where the stakes are much higher." Jason sat in shock, his eyes widening at the unexpected truth. He was part of something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. "Who are you?" he asked, a growing sense of danger creeping into his voice. The old man looked at him with respect and sympathy. "We are the ones who control not only the streets, but also the important decisions in this world. You've become part of our game, Jason, and now that you're at the center of it, you have a choice. You can continue, be part of this world, or walk away and return to your old life, which no longer exists for you." Jason was stunned. He understood that the world he had found himself in was far more complicated than he had ever thought. The thugs, the coincidences, even his own actions, everything had been part of one grand game. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" His voice was full of pain and disappointment. The old man shook his head. "Because you weren't ready. You had to prove to yourself that you could survive in this game. And now, having gone through this, you stand at the threshold of a decision that will change your life." Jason understood that his life no longer belonged to him. The old man's gaze, his calmness and determination, made him feel as though his own freedom was slipping away. He was caught in a web from which it wouldn't be easy to escape. But despite the pain, Jason knew he had to make a choice. "What do you want from me?" he asked, wearily leaning back against the pillow. The old man leaned in a little closer, his face growing even more serious. "We need your skills, Jason. You've already proven you can fight and survive. Now, you'll be part of a team that decides the fates of entire cities. Will you play on the side of power or on the side of resistance? We're waiting for your answer." Jason nodded slowly, his mind filled with questions, but none of them could provide a clear answer. His world was now filled with more questions than answers. He understood that there was no going back, and the choice he made in that moment would not only determine his future, but the future of many others. The old man stood up, dusted off his suit, and looked at Jason. "We won't have time to wait long," he said, stepping out of the room. "Make your decision quickly." When the old man left, Jason was left in the room, surrounded by silence. He knew the world he had been offered was dangerous. He couldn't just ignore it, but he also couldn't fully embrace this path. He was at a crossroads, and although his body was exhausted, his mind continued to wrestle with this decision. He was ready. But what choice would he make? New enemies and dangers stood in his way, as well as the mysterious force that had decided his fate. This was only the first step in a long journey, and Jason didn't know what awaited him ahead.